My name is Jialin Yang. I'm a business editor at the Washington Post. To my left today, we have John McWilliams, who's Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. He serves as the Secretary's Senior Financial Advisor, and he's also a member of the Secretary's National Security Team. To his left, we have Tyler Duvall, who's a principal at McKinsey, who advises clients on infrastructure, transportation, and public sector practices on strategy and operations.
Hi, and I'm Chris Davenport. I'm a reporter on the financial desk here at the Post, and the other moderator. We have such intellectual firepower, we decided we need two moderators to rein these good people in. To my right is Dr. Jack Gansler, a professor and Roger T. Lippitz Chair in Public Policy and Private Enterprise at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Next to him is Mr. Alan Schaefer, Principal Deputy in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering at the Pentagon. And next to him is General Craig McKinley, the President and Chief Executive of the National Defense Industrial Association. Thank you so much for coming. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to jump right into it. We'll open this up to everyone, but I thought, Mr. Schaefer, if you would, we're talking today about innovation and collaboration, which is obviously a very important topic, but I wonder if you could set the stage for us a little bit at the Pentagon, and then we can go to some of these other areas, about why it's important, because there's so much talk now, particularly at the Pentagon, of how after 14 years of continuous war, we've fallen back some technologically, and other people have sort of stepped ahead of us, if you would.
Sure, I'm happy to. I think it's appropriate to start with a quote from Secretary Hagel, as the Senate is now voting on soon-to-be Secretary Carter, we hope. In his budget rollout last year, Secretary Hagel said that for the first time in several decades, American dominance in the air, on the ground, at sea, and in space is no longer assured. And simply, the rest of the world, through globalization of technology, has been developing capabilities that will stress some of our high-end capabilities. And it's a very interesting time because as we move forward with globalization of science and technology, commercial products being able to be used in a military sense, it is very hard to get that advantage. So we continue to field, for instance, or are in the process of fielding very exquisite systems. The Joint Strike Fighter comes to mind. That's an incredible aircraft. And yet, it's possible to affect some of the capability set through electronic attack by other folks. And other nations have studied very carefully how we employ our forces and what we're doing. So I think it's very important. Congressman Thornberry said we have to do better, and we have to do better at reaching out to pockets of innovation. He mentioned Deputy Secretary Work has a Defense Innovation Initiative, specifically looking at how do we change the way we do business, how do we change what we're buying to provide greater capabilities. We have, for the first time in several decades, a very focused long-range research development planning program, modeled after something that was done in the 70s that brought us to stealth, precision-guided munitions, GPS, precision navigation and timing. So all those capabilities that gave the U.S. and our allies an incredible advantage, they're about 30 years old. That's an incredible amount of time to have a military advantage. So this long-range research development planning program we'll report out in July is specifically looking at how do we think about the next generation of technology offset. And I want to mention, and then we'll open it up to other folks, how important it is to collaborate both with industry and with our partners. Our defense strategy says very clearly that one of our 5 key tenets is to build partnership with other nations, with allies, both at the high end and at the low end. And that's absolutely critical to where we're going in the future.
I wonder, Mr. Duvall or Mr. McWilliams, if you could talk a little bit, about why it's important from your point of view and your industry.
Sure. Maybe I'll start. The Department of Energy really, innovation is really central to our core missions, which are to, one, maintain the nuclear weapons stockpile, working closely with our colleagues in the Defense Department. 2 is cleaning up the legacy from the Manhattan Project and the Cold War, which is a daunting task. And 3, the department's the largest supporter of basic science and research in the United States through our 17 national labs. So innovation is very important in all those things, whether it's ARPA-E program, where summit's going on this week here in the city, or whether it's our loan program office. But in all of these areas, we need to find ways to leverage private capital and the markets through public-private partnerships to be able to do what we need to be able to do. So we can talk a little bit more about specifics in a second.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's been a ton written about the difficulties government has internally driving innovation, given the incentive failures, the cultural problems, institutional history. There's a lot written about how markets work to drive innovation. I think this nexus that we're hitting on in the panel is, there's a lot less written about how actually government can harness that, and it's not the most interesting topic to a lot of people. The contract structuring to drive innovation with a private partner, how you transfer risk in a contract with a private partner is not the coolest topic to write about all the time, but it is actually the engine that drives innovation. You can have contracts that stifle or lock in technologies with the private sector, and we've seen that in lots of different sectors in energy and transportation and others, and in defense, or we can have contracts that basically provide market incentives to innovate and compete and flourish. And I think the key for government is how do we get those contract structures right?
I mean, off of this point, some of you could also talk about, so what are some of these impediments that we're talking about when we talk about public-private partnership? And those of you coming from the government perspective, how do you make things look more attractive to private companies that might be leery of what they've heard about some of these red tape barriers?
We actually have disincentives built into the system against it right now. I'll pick up on Alan's point that people aren't aware. They think that the Defense Department's way ahead in everything. But if you actually look at the expenditures, we used to spend more on research, but today in the commercial world, there's twice the budget, annual budget, on research as in industry versus government. And internationally, it's more than twice as much as U.S. spends, total industry government. And so we need to take full advantage. If you assume that there's some relationship between what you spend and what you get, hopefully there is. And therefore, we want to have more use of commercial and use of foreign. And there are many critical defense technology areas where we're not ahead anymore. In fact, these curves, the funding curves crossed over in the mid-'80s. And now we're in many areas behind. So for example, trying to armor our vehicles, because the number one killer of Americans today is roadside bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we want to armor the infantry fighting vehicles. So we're buying the armor from Israel because they have the most unfriendly neighbors, obviously. So they are concerned about armor. And same thing, we used to own the night. We no longer are ahead in night vision devices. There are a number of areas where it's critical to military, but we're not. And what's happening today is, as Congressman mentioned, the budget has been going down. But the first three things that always get cut are research, training, and travel to conferences to learn, and so therefore what we have to do is to recognize that instead of buying 20th century stuff, we need to think about what's 21st century. And if you think about the acquisition process, there's really a bunch of decisions that are critical to this. One of them is what you buy, where you put your money, and we got to put our money into next generation stuff. And we need to think about what the scenarios are for next generation things. Rupert Smith in the UK wrote about the difference between tank on tank and war among the people. And certainly counter stealth is certainly something we're starting to think about. But even more important may be cybersecurity, which we have to worry about because every 16-year-old kid knows how to attack you now. And so there are a lot of things that we should be doing in terms of where we spend our money, but then the second most critical question is how we spend that money. And that's the acquisition process.
Right.
And that's where the important thing is how, the acquisition workforce. And there, other than the people in this room, we have an aging workforce. There's no question about that. And it's a real problem because as people have been retiring, we've been bringing in interns. Today, 55% of the acquisition workforce in the Defense Department have less than 5 years of experience of any sort.
So just playing up on that, General, I wonder, we talk about where innovation happens. So often it happens at small startups, Silicon Valley, that we don't typically think of as defense contractors or working with government. They see the federal acquisition regulations, which are what, 186,000 pages?
186,000 pages.
It's like the phone book swallowed
Code of
the
federal acquisition.
Yeah, I mean, and they look at that and they don't want any part of it. So how does the Defense Department or the Department of Energy get these small startups, the Googles of the world, not so small, but get these innovative companies to work with them?
It's a great question, and our chairman, Arnold Panaro, has tasked us to kind of look along with the other associations in town at how do we do that? Do we go out there and try to mine their techniques and tactics on how they're doing it? Google, Apple, Facebook don't need a lot of government infusion of money to survive. In fact, they just go no. And so the industries that we represent, the very large down to the small mom and pop industry that the chairman talked about in his session, depend on government interface. And as Dr. Gansler said, we have lost the ability, quite frankly, over the last 3 to 5 years of having the dialogue, the face-to-face collaboration between industry and government, which all our associations try to facilitate, to provide for that best practice buying power. And Dr. Gansler just spoke at NDIA last week on this very subject. The small businesses are critical to this, and if they can't get in the game, if they don't feel like they have a part, we're going to restrict innovation, a barrier to collaboration. Those are things we'd like to see change.
So the SBIR program certainly is intended to try to stimulate that
Absolutely.
the small business, but it's the rest of this 186,000 pages that are real discouragement.
It is.
We have rules against combining some commercial and military.
That's right.
Poor Boeing had to split their operation.
Ms. McWilliams?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is an area that the Department of Energy is very focused on. If you look at clean energy finance and innovation, we went through a period a few years ago where venture capitalists did invest quite aggressively in early stage technologies. They found it to be difficult. Many of them didn't have experience in regulated environments. And so we've been very concerned about how to find additional capital. The president just 2 days ago announced a new initiative that we're going to be managing, the Clean Energy Investment Initiative, $2 billion, specifically trying to work with foundations and other types of investors to come in and fill this gap. In the Loan Program Office, where we have about 30 projects and about $30 billion that have been deployed in loans and loan guarantees, we're also very focused on the same issue. Commercial solar, for example, wouldn't exist in this country if it hadn't been for the Loan Program Office, where we made the first 5 largest investments. We've now had 17 other projects that have been supported strictly by private industry now that we've kickstarted that. So that catalytic role is really something that we're trying to focus on.
The Department of Energy has taken a lead in the smart grid.
Yeah.
And that's really an important step. But there are also institutional resistance within the Pentagon to the next generation of stuff. I mean, I know when I was Undersecretary, 2 years in a row, the Air Force zeroed Global Hawk, the unmanned airplane. Now, it didn't need any life support system. It didn't even need a bathroom, for the pilot. But so the resistance was clearly a cultural resistance. Right. And why not go to the next generation stuff?
I think that while that is true, that we have a tremendous cultural resistance to change, when you're faced with what's becoming more and more of a challenge, change will come about, and the combined actions of increased threat with other peers and reduced budget is forcing us to look at things differently. You asked, how do we reach out to small companies and big companies? One of the best ways is really hard problems. So I will give a very short anecdote. We give out a quarterly Laboratory Scientist of the Department Award. We awarded it yesterday to a young scientist who had spent a couple of months actually embedded at Google to understand how they worked. And Google was more interested in not us giving them money, but us giving them very hard problems, because the people who work at places like Google, they work to solve really hard problems. And this young scientist did remarkable things tied into Google. So I see some real advantages with that type of model. The other way that we're finding to reach out to both large and small companies and we got a lot of help from Congress this year, is through increased use of challenge programs. So we all know about the DARPA challenge, the Unmanned Vehicle Challenge. We now can go to challenges up to $10 million for any individual event. In fact, Secretary
Just real quick,
James.
explain what a challenge is.
A challenge is where we go out to industry or academia, say we want to solve a problem. In the DARPA ground robotics case, it was go 500 miles in an unmanned vehicle from one point to another. We've had other types of challenges, largely done by DARPA, but now the Air Force and the services are getting involved because they see that as a way to present a problem with set parameters, and the person who best meets that parameter gets the winner-take-all prize, or however we set it up. So in the DARPA Grand Challenge, the winning team walked away with a couple $1 million. We walked away with better insight into how something could work, and we excited an entire group of young people into problems that are relevant to the Department of Defense. So as I said, Secretary James at the Air Force Association meeting this week intends to announce the next challenge for the Air Force. And it's going to be a fascinating challenge. I'm not going to get ahead of her, but watch for it, because it's going to be a fascinating challenge to bring in a lot of small industry to a problem that we need to have solved.
Tyler, if you want to talk a little about infrastructure, I mean, there's a lot of discussion President Obama talked about in the State of the Union about the need to really take on, in a very ambitious way, the country's infrastructure. You've got the highway funding running out this spring. Where does the private sector fit in all this?
Right. So what's interesting about the conversation, the reality is the problem statement is actually quite similar. I think what the government needs to do to attack it, obviously across the different disciplines represented up here, I think is different. But if you think about, kind of the role of the private sector in a PPP world relative to the historic world, it is effectively outsourcing of some core component that historically the government did internally. So there's the design, construction, operation, maintenance, and finance. Those are the key components of any project, defense, energy, transportation, whatever it is. And increasingly what we're finding on the infrastructure, civil infrastructure side is we got huge financing problems, so there's not enough capital to redeploy. But we also have huge innovation problems, so we're working with designs that are very old. We've got lots of opportunities to embed technology and infrastructure, talking about bridge sensors. But the current contracting mechanisms, acquisition mechanisms, are not transferring the opportunities to the private sector to do that. So we are awash in capital. I mean, there's not a capital formation problem in the U.S. There's more pools of capital in the U.S. to invest in long-term assets than anywhere in the world. All of our big pension funds, all the private equity funds have allocated capital to this. The problem on the government side is figuring out how to actually harness it. And so what happens is you go through a traditional acquisition or procurement process, and you, frankly, are not structuring contracts to the point where the right risks are transferred. You're either trying to transfer risks that the private sector can't bear, environmental risks, or maybe there's demand uncertainty around the use of the asset that they can't or unwilling to bear. So there's kind of an expectations gap where the government says, look, I want your capital. The private sector is like, well, that's too much risk. And they literally are driving like 2 different lanes of the highway. And I think that's where if you can get governments basically to set up institutional capacity inside to harness it, bringing in, frankly, the private sector expertise. There's a lot of fear in government that they're going to get out-negotiated by the private sector in these transactions. And I think increasingly what you're finding is they can arm themselves to compete quite well and negotiate.
And also a very radioactive issue in the department is base closure, realignment. The secretary thinks we have about 30% excess infrastructure. We've got to deal with that too on the DoD side so that we can get into some of these innovative strategies. Familiar with some of the bases that have realigned and closed. Those are doing some amazing things now with commercial applications. Tax base comes into the city. There is a huge constituency for our bases, though, and so that's going to have to be dealt with sooner or later.
Yeah, if you look at in our area, 50% of the National Nuclear Security Agency's facilities are over 40 years old. About 30% are Manhattan Project era. We've got 12 or 13% that are excess at this point. So we have very real issues there. I come from the private sector, and one of the things that I found, which surprised me and is an impediment, is that the government essentially operates on a cash basis as opposed to an accrual basis the way a company would. So in general, there are not the same concepts of accumulated depreciation. So what happens when you get into a tight fiscal environment, as all these gentlemen will know, is that, of course, we maintain safety and security, but after that, sometimes infrastructure doesn't get the funding that it needs. So we as a country have very, very significant infrastructure needs that are facing us, both in the national security side and also on the civilian side. On the civilian side, I've been leading our efforts at Department of Energy in a 12-agency effort called Build America that the President has announced, the Build America initiative. And that's focused more on roads and infrastructure, that type of things, water, that telecom and that kind of thing. But these are very, very pressing needs that we have.
I want to follow up real quick on this notion of public-private partnerships. And ask you, Dr. Gansler, quickly, and then we may go to some questions. What role does Congress play in that?
They say not in my district. But we've had some very successful public-private partnerships. Military housing is a good example of that. And we need to do a lot more of it. But the other side of that, which Congress also is playing a role in, is public-private competitions. We've had over 4,000 of those for non-inherently governmental work. You know, like wrench turning, I don't think is defined in the Constitution as inherently governmental work, but there are laws against it, competing them. And there's real barriers there that I think are very important. And we should be able to be more effective as well as efficient. And taking advantage of competition. Congress gives speeches about the value of competition all the time, but then writes laws against it.
It's hard when your customer's not just the government, but a political system. Allison, do we have any?
Hi, yeah. So one question is, what's an acceptable rate of return to foster innovation? Who wants to take that?
Could you repeat the question?
What is an acceptable rate of return to foster innovation?
Depends how you calculate it. I mean, does the Defense Department get return on investment for having started the internet?
GPS.
Or GPS.
Or GPS,
Yeah.
You mean on the private side? Is that the question? Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think we work with a lot of investors and governments on this exact question. I mean, it obviously depends on the asset class and the risk at the end of the day. I mean, if you're, an existing asset that you're trying to rehab or modernize in some form is going to be a lower risk than a greenfield asset where you're building something entirely new. They will demand higher returns, 16 to 20% returns when there's a high risk asset. But you can get into the low teens. Some have even asserted high single digits on some of the kind of called sleepier existing assets that are not high risk. But it's going to be more expensive. The real challenge is more expensive than traditional, floating a 30-year or 10-year treasury bond or going out to the municipal bond market if you're a state and local entity. This is going to be more expensive capital. So there has to be an innovation and cost efficiency benefit. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Whoops, I just wanted to follow up on something that was said earlier about government and the private sector having very different approaches to risk. How do you reconcile the two to work together? Or thoughts?
Well, I would say for Department of Defense and the military side, risk equates to injuries and loss of life on the battlefield. So how do you put a price on that? So that's why our senior leadership is so concerned about this collaborative effect and how do we do the best that we can. Dr. Gansler talked about purchasing armor from Israel. We should have industry here in the United States that can take leading edge technology and produce that. And they should be guaranteed a rate of return that ensures they stay in business. But we have to collaborate. It's a global world right now. But risk in the Department of Defense is life.
But at least that Israeli armor company did set up their factory in Vermont.
It's manufactured in the U.S., yeah.
Yeah, and so
That's great.
they recognize the Buy American requirement.
One more on the heels of that. Can anyone comment on the challenges of overcoming the challenges of collaborating internationally?
I think the biggest challenge in collaborating internationally is the excessive layers of our ITAR controlled items, so international trade and arms restrictions. We have a large number of both high-end and medium-end technologies that we put on an ITAR restricted list, and that prevents us from doing much internationally with some of our partners. So I think that any efforts to reform the ITAR list, the trade restriction lists, is well needed because other nations don't have the same types of restrictions that we do. So we have to work more, I think, more diligently to allow our industry and government to work more comfortably across international lines. We have to protect the very best technologies we have, but I think in some cases we've gone too far.
Well, Sam Nunn once told me, Jack, don't give me the theory, just tell me the story. And so I'll give you an example of what Alan's just talking about. Boeing had to pay $15 million to export a commercial transport because one chip in the electronics actually was also in the Maverick missile. And so we have a law that says any subsystems that are in weapon systems also can't be exported. And so we're trying to now use more commercial chips in that case, and paying $15 million and prohibiting export of a commercial item is going to discourage commercial firms from trying to work with us.
Right.
And that's why we need to revise the export control provisions, I think.
We've alluded a little bit to budget cuts and sensitivity on cost. Maybe we could just talk a little bit more about that, how you operate in that kind of environment. Are things significantly different than they felt even a couple of years ago, from your perspective?
Yes. So with and Congressman Thornberry alluded to this, the sequester is bad because it doesn't allow you to do long-term planning. We go lurching from program to program, and when you don't have a long-term steady stream of research dollars available, you end up being somewhat inefficient. We'll start programs and have the sequester hit to terminate programs. And more important than having a lot of money, everybody wants a lot of money, but more important in research is stability over time so you can plan projects. Research, technology development, research and development, new system development takes years sometimes. And you have to know that you're going to have a steady stream of funding to allow you to really make some of the revolutionary advances we're seeking.
And programs are important.
Yep.
And readiness also has a place in this too. We sacrifice readiness when budgets tighten. For example, last summer, a number of Air Force squadrons were grounded. They didn't have the money to keep them airborne. It will take 10 years to buy back that readiness. That's fine in a world where you don't have a near-peer competitor. But sooner or later, we will. And to buy back that readiness is twice as expensive, maybe 3 or 4 times as expensive.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen is we manage some of the largest and most complex projects in the world. And we historically at the Department of Energy have had difficulty with large capital projects, specifically a half a dozen or so that are in the nuclear area. So when you're dealing with very, very large multi-billion-dollar projects, the same issue that you were referring to, and you have an appropriation cycle that's moving up and down, and one year you might have a few $100 million allocated, the next you might have 600. That's a very inefficient way to build a large project. And what happens is it results in increasing the total project cost over time.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in addition to the federal budget issue, OMB interpretations around this are actually quite important. And I mean, OMB historically has had grave concerns about using the private sector to effectively take projects off balance sheet. And the United Kingdom has kind of led the world in doing big PPP transactions across all the asset classes we're talking here and ran into a lot of kind of budget concerns. So there are OMB circulars, interpretations around basic contracting out mechanisms that require you to recognize those expenditures for, say, a 20 or 30-year lease in year one, which means you've got to have squirreled away all of that cash. Yeah. And that's a very hard, you obviously transactionally can't do that. So OMB has legitimate concerns about that, but it is a real obstacle.
I just want real quick, because we're running out of time. We've talked a lot about collaboration between government and industry, and somebody touched on this earlier. I wonder about the role that universities play and that academia plays, because obviously they're a big part of that. Does anyone want to?
Well, one of the main things that happens is the university, in many cases, is aware of what's going around the world. They have visibility into technology around the world and commercially. And then a lot of these professors who do have a good idea and knowing what other people are doing will set up a small business.
Right.
And that's where these small business, the SBIR program, the Small Business Innovative Research Program, is a big payoff. But we get a lot of objection from people who say that's a tax on my research, and then not recognizing that the small companies are and the universities are sources of research. And so we have to continue to fund those activities.
Yeah, academia is critical to where we are to bring in some of the new ideas. And we're trying some new types of approaches. So one of our programs is called the Multidisciplinary University Research, where you get different groups of universities coming together on a single problem. This year we're trying, for the first time that we can find in history, an actual United States, United Kingdom where we're bringing together the best universities in the US and the UK to expand our academic pool. And I think that that's good for both the United States, and it's good for the United Kingdom, and it's good for the alliance.
I would just say that obviously universities play a very important role in our clean energy objectives to lower the carbon content of energy. University of California, for example, recently has made shown some strong leadership in this area.